The room was supposed to be about discipline, respect, and control, but that morning the air inside the martial arts academy felt sharp, almost predatory. The mats were clean, the American flag hung stiff against the wall, and students stood in neat rows waiting for instruction. Then it happened. A white instructor in a crisp white GI, his black belt worn like a badge of unquestioned authority, looked past his students and locked eyes with the black janitor standing near the edge of the mat. The man was still wearing his navy blue work uniform, yellow rubber gloves tucked into his back pocket, mop bucket just a few feet away. The instructor smiled, slow and deliberate, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Hey janitor, you want to spar? Just for fun." Laughter rippled through the room, not loud, not brave, but cruel enough to sting. The janitor didn't laugh. He didn't move. And that was the moment something in the room shifted, even if no one understood why yet. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now back to the mat, where the instructor stepped forward as if this was already settled, as if the outcome was obvious. He gestured casually toward the center, speaking to his students instead of the man he had just challenged, telling them to relax, that he'd go easy, that it wouldn't take more than a minute. A few students smirked. Someone muttered that the floor still needed cleaning. The janitor stood quietly, eyes level, posture straight, absorbing every word without reacting. To them, he wasn't a person with a choice. He was background. He was labor. He was someone who scrubbed sweat and blood off the mats after they left, someone who existed in the building but didn't belong on the mat. That assumption hung heavier than the flag on the wall. The instructor stepped closer, invading his space, tapping 2 fingers lightly against the janitor's chest as if to reassure him, as if to remind him of his place, saying he wouldn't hurt him, saying this was just a little entertainment before real training started. The students watched, some uncomfortable, most silent, none intervening. Silence did what it always does in moments like this. It chose a side. The janitor slowly reached behind him and pulled the yellow gloves free, one at a time, the soft snap of rubber barely audible against the hum of the room. He set them down neatly at the edge of the mat. That small action drew a few confused looks. Someone frowned. Another student tilted their head, trying to understand why the movement felt deliberate, controlled, almost ceremonial. The instructor laughed again, louder this time, motioning him forward, telling him not to worry, telling him he could stop whenever he wanted. What no one noticed was the way the janitor's breathing never changed, the way his feet aligned naturally with the mat, or how his eyes tracked distance and balance instead of faces. To them, this was a joke built on assumption, on skin color, on uniform, on status. They saw a janitor who should have stayed in the corner. They didn't see the discipline in his stillness. They didn't hear the years behind his silence. And they certainly didn't imagine that in a room full of black belts, the most dangerous person might be the one they had just tried to humiliate for fun. The instructor clapped his hands once, sharp and commanding, signaling the class to form a loose circle around the mat, as if this were a demonstration instead of a provocation, and the students obeyed without thinking because hierarchy had already trained them to. He rolled his shoulders, loosened his neck, and spoke with the casual confidence of someone who had never been questioned in this room, telling the janitor again that this was friendly, that no one was trying to embarrass anyone, even as his tone did the exact opposite. He asked the man if he had ever trained before, not because he wanted an answer, but because the question itself was meant to remind everyone who belonged where. The janitor nodded once, slowly, and said that he had trained, but did not add where or when, and the instructor laughed, waving it off, saying that mopping floors did not count as mat time. A few students smiled. One shook his head like he had already seen the ending. The instructor stepped onto the mat first, planting his feet wide, bouncing lightly, showing off his balance, his belt swinging with each movement, while the janitor stepped on more quietly, his shoes already off, his socks gripping the surface like he had walked on mats like this before, a detail no one noticed because they were too busy watching the belt. The instructor explained the rules loudly for the room. No strikes to the head, Light contact only. Stop when he said stop, framing himself as generous and responsible, while the janitor listened without interrupting, eyes steady, hands relaxed at his sides, not raised, not clenched, just present. Someone in the back whispered that this was going to be quick. Someone else said they hoped the janitor did not get hurt because they would still need the floor cleaned later. The instructor smirked and stepped in closer, lowering his voice now, so only the man in front of him could hear, telling him that this was what happened when people forgot their place, telling him that the mat was not for everyone. That respect was earned here, not given. The janitor did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply shifted his weight half an inch, a movement so small it looked like nothing, but it placed him just outside the instructor's center line, something experienced fighters recognize instantly and inexperienced eyes completely miss. The instructor lunged lightly, more of a test than an attack, expecting the man to flinch or back away, expecting fear, but the janitor did neither, stepping to the side with quiet precision, letting the instructor's momentum pass him like a wave missing the shore. A murmur rippled through the circle, confusion more than surprise, because the movement did not look dramatic, it just looked correct. The instructor frowned, adjusted his stance, and tried again, this time adding speed, a quick grab meant to control the arms and end the joke, but his hand closed on empty space. The janitor already gone from where he had been, already repositioned, already balanced. The room went quieter, not because anyone understood yet, but because something familiar was no longer working the way it was supposed to. The instructor laughed again, louder, sharper, telling everyone that he was warming up, telling the janitor to stop dancing and actually engage, but the confidence in his voice had thinned, stretched tight by the effort of maintaining it. The janitor finally spoke, his voice calm, respectful, and firm, saying that if they were going to do this, they should do it properly. And the word properly landed heavier than any insult because it implied standards the instructor might not meet. A student near the flag leaned forward, eyes narrowing, recognizing posture, recognizing spacing, recognizing the kind of control that does not come from belts or titles, but from repetition and discipline. The instructor circled again, faster now, irritation leaking through his smile, and the janitor matched him step for step without mirroring, without chasing, maintaining distance with the ease of someone who had learned not to waste motion. The laughter was gone. The whispers stopped. The room was no longer watching a joke. It was watching something it had not planned for, something that did not fit the story it had already written about who belonged on the mat and who did not. And the discomfort in the air had nothing to do with fear of injury and everything to do with the slow, creeping realization that the assumptions holding this place together were starting to crack. The instructor's breathing grew louder as he circled, the sound no longer hidden by confidence, but sharpened by irritation, and he told himself that control was slipping only because he was being too careful, because he was being kind, because this was still beneath him. He feinted again, faster, stepping in with a grab meant to assert dominance rather than technique, but the janitor rotated his shoulder just enough to break the line, guiding the instructor's arm past him with a touch so light it felt insulting, not violent, and the instructor stumbled half a step forward before catching himself. A few students exchanged looks, the kind that ask a question without speaking it, because what they were seeing did not match what they had been taught to expect. The instructor snapped his head up, forcing a grin, telling the room that balance drills were part of the lesson, telling the janitor to stop playing games, yet his eyes kept flicking to the man's feet, to the calm placement, to the absence of wasted motion. He stepped in harder this time, adding force, letting frustration bleed into his technique, and for the first time the janitor responded not by retreating but by entering the space, closing distance with a timing that stole the instructor's breath. There was no strike, no throw, just pressure, precise and controlled, placed at the exact point where balance fails, and the instructor felt it immediately, a warning written into his own body. The circle tightened. Someone near the back swallowed hard. Someone else whispered that this was not normal. The instructor backed off, hands raised, laughing again, but the laugh cracked halfway through, and he told the janitor to relax, saying that they were getting carried away, that this was supposed to be light, yet he was the one who had lost the rhythm. The janitor stood where he was, hands still low, shoulders loose, not chasing, not posturing, simply waiting, and the waiting unsettled everyone more than aggression ever could. A woman in the front row leaned forward, recognizing restraint, recognizing the difference between someone trying to win and someone who already knew how. The instructor tried to reset the room with his voice, reminding everyone that belts mattered, that rank mattered, that this place ran on structure, and he told the janitor again to show some respect, to remember where he was. The janitor met his eyes calmly and said that respect worked both ways, that the mat did not care who cleaned it and who taught on it. And the words landed heavy, not shouted, not dramatic, but undeniable. A murmur spread, not laughter this time, but discomfort, because the truth had slipped through without permission. The instructor lunged again, faster, more desperate now, attempting a sweep he had practiced 1,000 times, and the janitor countered it without force, stepping over the leg, guiding the momentum downward, stopping just short of a full takedown, leaving the instructor bent forward, caught, exposed, held in place by balance alone. Time stretched. The room froze. The janitor released him immediately, stepping back, giving space, giving dignity, and that mercy cut deeper than any strike. The instructor straightened, face flushed, eyes wide, realizing that the entire room had seen it, that nothing had been hidden, that no one had looked away this time. He tried to speak, but the words came out tangled, a mix of authority and defense, insisting that this was enough, that the demonstration was over, yet his voice no longer carried the same weight. A student near the wall glanced at the mop bucket, then back at the man on the mat, and the old hierarchy wavered. The janitor remained silent, breathing steady, gaze neutral, not claiming victory, not asking for approval, simply existing in the space he had been told he did not belong. And in that moment, the room understood something it had never prepared for. That skill does not announce itself, that power does not need permission, and that the line between who is seen and who is ignored can collapse the instant assumptions are challenged, leaving everyone standing in the uncomfortable aftermath of what they can no longer deny. The silence that followed did not break cleanly. It thickened, settling over the mat as the instructor stepped backward and lifted a hand, signaling an end he did not control anymore. And he told the class that this was enough, that the point had been made, that everyone should reset. Yet his eyes avoided the janitor as if looking too long might confirm something he was not ready to face. A few students hesitated, unsure whether to relax or keep watching, because the authority they were used to responding to now sounded rehearsed instead of absolute. The janitor remained still, hands lowered, shoulders loose, not pressing forward, not stepping away, giving the room space to decide what it was going to do with what it had just witnessed. The instructor cleared his throat and began speaking louder, explaining that discipline meant knowing when to stop, that rank existed for a reason, that what just happened was not a challenge to the system. But his words felt thinner with every sentence, stretched across a room that had already shifted. A student near the front raised his hand halfway, then lowered it again, the question dying before it reached his mouth, while another glanced toward the door as if checking whether someone else had noticed. The janitor finally stepped off the mat, not hurried, not apologetic, retrieving his gloves with the same care he had set them down, and that quiet exit drew more attention than any victory pose could have. The instructor watched him go and felt something unfamiliar crawl up his spine, not fear of being hurt, but fear of being seen clearly for the first time. Someone whispered that the janitor moved like a professional. Someone else shook their head, saying that it must have been luck, that everyone has a moment, but the explanation did not sit right, because luck does not look that calm. The instructor clapped his hands again, sharper this time, telling everyone to line up, to focus, to remember why they were there, and he made a point of standing taller, adjusting his belt, reasserting visual authority, but the room no longer responded the same way. Eyes drifted. Minds wandered back to the balance break, the controlled release, the restraint that had been offered without request. A woman who had been training there for years stared at the mat, replaying the movement in her head, realizing she had never been taught that level of control, realizing that something important had been missing from the lesson she trusted. The instructor launched into a drill, demonstrating it with extra force, striking pads harder than necessary, breathing louder, performing confidence instead of embodying it, and the class followed out of habit, not belief. In the corner, the janitor resumed his work, mop gliding across the floor with steady rhythm. The same hands that had moments earlier redirected power now returning to labor without complaint, and that contrast unsettled the room more than confrontation ever could. One student finally spoke, asking quietly who the janitor was, where he had trained, and the instructor snapped back that it did not matter, that credentials mattered, that people should stop reading into things, but his defensiveness answered the question more clearly than honesty would have. The janitor passed by the edge of the mat, and a few students instinctively stepped aside, not out of fear, but respect they had not consciously chosen. The instructor noticed and felt his jaw tighten, the loss of invisible control stinging worse than any physical blow. He told himself this would pass, that tomorrow the hierarchy would reset, that stories like this fade when authority refuses to acknowledge them. But the room had already archived the moment. When class finally ended, people lingered longer than usual, exchanging looks instead of words, and the janitor finished his last pass across the mat, paused for a brief moment to look at the space, then turned off the lights one row at a time. The darkness did not erase what had happened. It preserved it, sealing the truth into the memory of everyone who stood there and realized, too late to unsee it, that the line between who was considered powerful and who was considered invisible had just been crossed, not with noise or violence, but with control, restraint, and a silence that demanded to be answered. The next morning the academy felt different before anyone said a word, as if the walls themselves remembered what had happened and were waiting to see who would pretend it had not. And the instructor arrived early, jaw tight, movements sharp, determined to reclaim control before doubt could spread any further. When the janitor entered with his cart, the instructor stopped mid-sentence and watched him longer than necessary, then made a point of speaking louder to the early students, reminding them that the mat was not a playground, that respect came from rank, and that distractions would not be tolerated. The janitor moved quietly along the edge, wiping down the same surfaces he always did, but the air thickened when the instructor finally addressed him directly, telling him to stay off the mat today, telling him that yesterday had crossed a line, that it had made people uncomfortable, as if discomfort had not been the goal when the challenge was issued. The janitor paused, met his eyes, and said calmly that he had not stepped onto the mat until he was invited, and that he would not do so again unless asked, and that measured response irritated the instructor more than defiance ever could. A student arrived late and whispered to another about what had happened, and the instructor snapped, demanding silence, demanding focus, demanding that the story stop right there. But stories do not stop just because authority asks them to. He began class aggressively, correcting movements with unnecessary force, calling out mistakes louder than usual, asserting dominance through volume and proximity, and when a student asked a simple question about balance, the instructor cut him off, saying that balance came from discipline, not tricks, glancing briefly toward the janitor as he spoke. The janitor continued working, but the words followed him, pulling memories forward without warning, memories of other rooms and other uniforms, of being told to wait outside, of being asked who he thought he was, of being mistaken for help even when he wore something else, of learning long ago that silence was safer than explanation. The instructor's voice rose again, accusing the janitor of showing off, of disrespecting the academy, of undermining him in front of his students. And when the janitor replied that none of that had been his intention, that he had only responded to what was asked of him, the instructor laughed sharply and said that people like him always said that, always pretended innocence after causing trouble. The words people like him landed hard, drawing a few sharp inhales from the room, and for the first time someone spoke up, saying quietly that it had not looked like showing off, that it had looked controlled, and the instructor spun on him, warning him about questioning authority. The tension snapped when the instructor stepped too close to the janitor, crowding his space, telling him that this was his academy, that janitors cleaned and instructors taught, and that if he did not like that, he could find another job. The janitor did not raise his voice, but he did straighten, saying that respect did not come from a belt or a title, that it came from how people treated each other when they thought no one important was watching. The instructor scoffed and said that he was done with the attitude, that he would call the owner if he had to, that he would have security remove the janitor for disrupting class, and a few students shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the familiar escalation, the move from insult to threat. The janitor nodded once, slowly, saying that he understood, and went back to his cart, but the room had already crossed a point of no return. A woman near the door watched him pass and felt a knot form in her chest, because she had seen this before too. The way competence became a threat when it came from the wrong place. The way authority protected itself by reframing dignity as defiance. The instructor made the call anyway, speaking loudly into his phone, describing the janitor as a problem, as someone who did not know his place. And when he hung up, he looked around as if expecting approval. But what he found instead was silence, heavy and judging. The janitor finished his task, parked his cart, and stood waiting, not because he was afraid, but because he knew what came next, and as footsteps echoed down the hall, the room held its breath, caught between the comfort of old hierarchies and the growing awareness that once a line is crossed, it can never fully be redrawn. The footsteps stopped just outside the room, and before anyone entered, the instructor straightened his posture as if authority alone could shield him, while the janitor stood beside his cart with his hands resting calmly on the handle, neither defensive nor submissive, simply present. The door opened and a man in a dark jacket stepped inside. Not security as expected, but the regional operations manager who oversaw multiple academies in the area, his expression neutral as he scanned the room and felt the tension immediately. The instructor rushed to fill the silence, speaking fast, framing the situation as a disruption, saying the janitor had overstepped, that he had caused confusion and challenged the structure of the academy, carefully leaving out how it had started. The manager listened without interrupting, then turned his attention to the janitor and asked him calmly what had happened, not accusing, not dismissive, just asking. The janitor explained in the same measured tone he had used all along, saying that he had been invited onto the mat, that he had participated respectfully, that he had stopped when it was over, and that he had returned to his work without complaint, adding that he never intended to embarrass anyone. The instructor scoffed, insisting that intention did not matter, that impact did, that students were questioning his authority now, and that order needed to be restored. The manager nodded slowly, then asked a question that shifted the room, asking who had invited whom, and when the instructor hesitated, eyes flicking toward the students, the answer arrived without words. A student near the wall spoke up, voice steady but nervous, saying that the instructor had called the janitor out in front of everyone, that it was supposed to be a joke, and that it did not feel like one. Another student added that the janitor had never disrespected anyone, that he had shown control, not aggression. The instructor snapped at them to stay out of it, but the manager raised a hand, stopping him, and asked the students to continue. More voices followed, hesitant at first, then clearer, describing what they had seen, how the balance had shifted, how the moment had exposed something uncomfortable about how people were treated when they were assumed to be lesser. The instructor's face tightened as the narrative slipped beyond his control, and he tried to reclaim it by appealing to rank and policy, insisting that belts existed for a reason, that allowing exceptions undermined the system. The manager listened, then asked quietly whether respect was part of the system too, and the question landed harder than any accusation. The janitor remained silent during the exchange, eyes lowered not in shame but restraint, letting others speak because the truth no longer needed his voice alone. The manager asked the instructor whether he had used language that crossed a line, and when the instructor denied it, a woman near the door repeated the phrase "people like him" aloud, the room collectively exhaling, as if releasing something it had been holding since the day before. The manager closed his eyes briefly, then asked the janitor if he had formal training, and when the janitor answered honestly that he did, that he had trained for many years before taking this job, that he chose work that paid the bills and kept him grounded, the manager nodded, understanding settling in. He reminded the room that skill and character did not disappear because someone wore a different uniform, and that leadership was measured by how power was used, not how loudly it was defended. The instructor protested, saying this was being blown out of proportion, but his words now sounded small against the clarity forming around him. The manager announced that the class would be paused, that an internal review would take place, and that everyone would be heard, including the janitor, and that decision marked the turning point, because for the first time the system acknowledged him as more than background. As the manager stepped aside to make a call, the instructor stood rigid, realizing that the story he had tried to control was now being documented, while the janitor quietly returned his gloves to his pocket, not victorious, not defeated, but steady, knowing that the moment was no longer about proving skill, but about exposing the cost of assumptions and the consequences that follow when silence finally gives way to truth. The manager returned to the center of the room and asked everyone to remain where they were, his voice calm but firm, the kind that did not need to announce authority because it carried it naturally, and he explained that the review would begin immediately, not later, not behind closed doors, but right here while memories were fresh and accounts were honest. The instructor bristled at that, insisting that this was unnecessary, that policies existed for a reason, that public discussions undermined leadership. Yet the manager reminded him that leadership that could not withstand daylight was already compromised. He asked the instructor again to walk through exactly how the interaction had started, step by step, and when the instructor repeated his version with softened language and selective omissions, the manager turned to the students and asked them to fill in what was missing. One by one, voices rose, some shaky, some steadier than they expected, describing the tone, the laughter, the invitation that had not felt optional, the way the janitor had been framed as entertainment rather than a participant. A student admitted that he had laughed at first, not because it was funny, but because laughing felt safer than questioning the moment, and that confession shifted the room, exposing how easily cruelty hid behind comfort. The manager listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, then turned to the janitor and asked him a single question, asking why he had agreed to step onto the mat at all. The janitor paused, choosing his words carefully, and said that he agreed because he was tired of being spoken about instead of spoken to, tired of being invisible until someone needed a joke, and because he believed that discipline meant meeting a challenge without ego, even when the challenge was unfair. The instructor scoffed under his breath, but the sound drew more attention than agreement, and the manager asked him directly whether he believed the janitor deserved respect before the sparring began. The instructor hesitated, then replied that respect was earned, and the manager asked how. If the invitation itself was framed as humiliation. Silence followed, thick and inescapable. The manager then addressed the room, explaining that skill was not the issue under review, that power dynamics were, and that what concerned him most was not that the instructor had been outmatched in a moment, but that he had used his position to demean someone he believed could not answer back. He stated clearly that this academy was not a stage for reinforcing hierarchy through ridicule, and that any system that required someone else to be smaller in order to feel large was not discipline. It was insecurity wearing tradition like armor. The instructor tried to defend himself again, saying that intent mattered, that he had not meant it that way, and the manager replied that intent did not erase impact, especially when patterns repeated themselves unchecked. He revealed that there had been prior complaints about tone and conduct, brushed aside as misunderstandings, and that this incident had brought them back into focus. The instructor's face drained as the weight of documentation settled in, the realization dawning that this was not an isolated moment anymore, but part of a recorded pattern. The manager announced that the instructor would be placed on immediate administrative leave pending the outcome of the review, and the room reacted with a collective intake of breath, not shock, but release, as if something heavy had finally been acknowledged out loud. The instructor protested, raising his voice, demanding to know if he was really being punished because a janitor embarrassed him, and the manager corrected him calmly, saying that he was being held accountable because he had embarrassed himself. The janitor did not celebrate, did not speak, did not change his posture, because the moment was not about winning, it was about truth finally being recognized by someone with the authority to act on it. The manager then turned to the janitor and thanked him for his restraint, saying that many people would have responded with anger, and that restraint was a mark of true discipline. He told the room that assumptions had blinded them, that titles had become shields, and that today had stripped those shields away. As the instructor gathered his things under quiet supervision, the janitor stood by his cart, the same place he had been when this started, yet the space around him felt different now, heavier with understanding, lighter with honesty, and as the manager concluded the session by reminding everyone that dignity was not optional and respect was not hierarchical, the academy confronted a truth it could no longer avoid, that the most powerful lesson taught there that day had not come from a belt or a badge, but from a man they had assumed did not belong on the mat at all. The academy did not empty the way it usually did after a difficult session, because people lingered, drawn together by the weight of what had just unfolded, and the manager remained on site, speaking quietly with staff and students while documentation was completed, his presence steady and unhurried. The instructor, now separated from the mat he once commanded, moved through the room gathering his belongings under watchful eyes, his earlier bravado replaced by tight movements and a rigid jaw, and no one stepped aside for him this time. The janitor continued his work at the edge of the space, mopping where feet had scuffed the floor, the sound rhythmic and grounding, as if reminding the room that life continued even after power shifted. Students began to approach the manager one at a time, offering statements, clarifying details, admitting things they wished they had said sooner, and the manager listened, taking notes, thanking them for honesty rather than courage, emphasizing that truth mattered more than performance. A woman who had trained there for years asked quietly whether things would actually change or whether this would be buried like other uncomfortable moments, and the manager answered without hesitation that the review would be formal, documented, and binding, that accountability would not be optional, and that the academy would be evaluated for culture as much as curriculum. That answer traveled quickly through the room, loosening shoulders, steadying breath, replacing cynicism with cautious belief. The instructor tried once more to assert his version, telling the manager that he had lost control of the class because people were being sensitive, that standards were being diluted, but the manager responded evenly that standards that protected humiliation were not standards worth keeping. He reminded everyone that discipline was about mastery of self, not domination of others, and that any teaching environment that confused the two would inevitably harm more than it helped. The janitor paused his work when his name was called, and the manager asked him to share his background for the record, not as spectacle, but as context, and the janitor spoke plainly, describing years of training, competitions that taught restraint more than aggression, and the decision to take steady work that allowed him to support family without sacrificing dignity. There was no boasting, no appeal for sympathy, just facts offered without ornament, and the room absorbed them quietly. A student near the wall wiped at her eyes, surprised by her own reaction, not because of what was said, but because of how long it had taken for someone like him to be asked at all. The manager thanked the janitor for his patience and asked whether he felt safe continuing his work there, making it clear that the answer would guide next steps, and the janitor replied that safety was built by behavior, not promises, and that what mattered now was follow-through. The manager agreed and stated that interim leadership would be appointed, that training protocols would be reviewed, and that reporting channels would be made explicit and protected, not theoretical. As the instructor was escorted out, he looked back once, searching the room for validation that did not come, and the quiet that followed him was not hostile, but resolved. Students began to leave in small groups, speaking in low voices, replaying moments, challenging assumptions they had not known they held, and the janitor finished his final pass across the mat, rinsed the mop, and set the bucket aside with care. Before leaving, the manager stopped him and said that the academy would like him to consider sharing his experience in a future workshop on control and respect, not as a novelty, but as a standard, and the janitor nodded without committing, understanding that real change was measured over time. When the lights dimmed and the doors finally closed, the academy stood quieter than it ever had, not emptied of tension but filled with consequence, because the collapse that occurred there was not of a building or a brand, but of a false certainty, and in its place remained a harder, truer lesson, that dignity cannot be demanded while denying it to others, and that the cost of ignoring that truth eventually comes due, witnessed, recorded, and impossible to dismiss. Weeks later, the academy no longer felt like a place that pretended nothing had happened, because change leaves traces even when walls stay the same, and the first sign was not a banner or a statement, but a difference in how people entered the room, slower, more aware, less certain of old shortcuts. Interim leadership had been installed, training schedules adjusted, and new guidelines posted where everyone could see them. Yet the most important shift was quieter, carried in posture and tone rather than policy. Students spoke to one another differently now. Questions were asked without mockery, corrections were given without contempt, and the mat began to resemble what it had always claimed to be, a place for discipline rather than dominance. The janitor continued to arrive early and leave late, his routine unchanged, but the space around him had transformed. People greeted him by name, not out of obligation, but recognition, and some asked him questions about balance, about restraint, about how to stay calm when provoked. He answered when he chose to, never positioning himself as a master, only as someone who understood that control started long before contact. One evening, after class had ended and the last students filtered out, the manager returned for a follow-up visit, walking the mat with the new lead instructor, reviewing progress, listening more than he spoke, and when he saw the janitor finishing his work, he paused and thanked him again, not for what had happened weeks earlier, but for what had followed, for staying, for showing that dignity did not require an audience. The janitor nodded, accepting the words without ceremony, because respect that needed to be displayed was not the kind he valued. Over time, the story traveled beyond the academy, not as gossip, but as a lesson repeated in different voices, stripped of spectacle, and centered on accountability. And those who heard it recognized something familiar, the way power often reveals itself by how quickly it feels threatened. The instructor who had been placed on leave did not return, and his absence became part of the architecture, a reminder that titles could be removed when they were used to harm rather than teach. Students who had once laughed quietly now found themselves reflecting loudly, examining the moments when they had chosen comfort over courage, and some admitted that the most difficult part was accepting how easily they had gone along with it. The janitor never asked for acknowledgement of that reckoning, because he had lived with its weight long before anyone else noticed it, and he understood that transformation was not proven in apologies, but in altered behavior sustained over time. One afternoon, during a workshop on control and ethics, a student asked what he should do if he ever found himself in a position of authority and felt tempted to use it to put someone in their place, and the janitor answered without hesitation, saying that if you need someone else to feel small for you to feel large, you have already lost control of yourself. The room absorbed that sentence in silence, because it landed where belts and lectures never had. As months passed, the academy gained a different reputation, not for aggression, but for integrity, and new students arrived drawn by stories of fairness rather than fear. The janitor watched those changes unfold the way he had watched the mat that first day, quietly, without expectation, knowing that systems rarely change because of one moment, but because enough people refuse to forget it. On a final evening before closing up, he turned off the lights one row at a time, the same way he always had, and stood for a moment in the doorway, looking back at the empty space, aware that he had never needed permission to belong there, only the chance to be seen as he was. The lesson that remained did not announce itself with applause or punishment, but settled into the walls, steady and enduring, that silence mistaken for weakness is often restraint, that dignity survives even when denied, and that true discipline is revealed not in how power is displayed, but in how it is restrained when it would be easiest to abuse it.